Welcome. It's wonderful to see this capacity crowd here today. My name is Ali Kasser-Mamtula. I work in the Provost's office, and I'm currently serving as the Acting Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion at the Graduate School. And it's my immense pleasure to welcome you all here for our second annual Women in Science lecture. Our first lecture took place last April, and we had Joan Stites from Yale University. She is a professor of molecular biophysics and biochemistry. So she gave our inaugural lecture, and today we are thrilled to have Princeton's very own Shirley Tillman, President Emerita, giving us our second lecture. I'm not going to go on at length. Shirley said to be really quick and get to the entree, so my appetizer is going to be very short. But I did want to say that as part of our work at the graduate school to support diversity, we're particularly focused on women in STEM and also underrepresented minorities in all fields across the university. And as part of our work, we support a number of student groups, including a number of groups that are women in STEM groups. Most of these groups are actually disciplinary based, but each of these groups has a representative that serves on a Women in STEM Leadership Council that's convened by the graduate school. So I'm actually going to introduce one of our Leadership Council members who is going to do the formal introduction of President Tillman. And I'm going to say a little bit about her before she comes up. Jennifer is a fifth-year graduate student in EEB, that's Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. She works with Dan Rubenstein, and her work is focused on animal behavior and conservation in East Africa. Jennifer focuses on cattle and wildlife interactions in Kenya and is developing management strategies that support both human livelihood and wildlife conservation. In addition to her role on the Leadership Council, she is a member of the EEB Women in Science Partnership Group and the Leadership Council of GY. So welcome, Jennifer Shields.
Thank you. So as Ali mentioned before, I introduced today's speaker. I just want to briefly introduce the Women in STEM Graduate Council, which is putting on this event today. So as he mentioned, the graduate school at Princeton supports a number of student-led organizations that focus on topics relevant to women in STEM, and each of these groups has their own mission, purpose, and programming, but they all share an emphasis on support, research, and mentorship of women in the STEM fields. So each of these organizations has a seat on the Women in STEM Leadership Council, which is convened by the diversity and inclusion team of the grad school. So I'm one of those members. The council's made up of leaders from the various organizations, student organizations, and we work together to address issues faced by women across science, math, and engineering, including making the administration aware of experiences and concerns and advocating for some changes we might like to see happen. So if anyone else is interested in becoming more involved in this council, you can talk to me afterwards or feel free to email Jennifer Losey, who's been sending you all the emails about this event. And without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today. A native of Canada, Shirley Tillman arrived at Princeton in 1986 as the Howard A. Pryor Professor in the Life Sciences. In 1988, she was appointed an investigator of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and in 1998 was named the founding director of Princeton's multidisciplinary Lewis Sigler Institute for Integrative Genomics. In 2001, she was elected Princeton University's 19th president. During her tenure, the university expanded its undergraduate and graduate student bodies and instituted a four-year college system. She oversaw the creation of major new academic programs, including the Princeton Neuroscience Institute, the Andlinger Center for Energy and the Environment, and the Lewis Center for the Arts. Upon completion of her term in June of 2013, she returned to the faculty. She's also the recipient of a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Society for Developmental Biology, the Genetic Society of America Medal, the L'Oreal UNESCO Award for Women in Science. She's a member of the American Philosophical Society, the National Academy of Sciences, the Institute of Medicine, the Royal Society of London, and is an officer of the Order of Canada. She serves as a trustee for Amherst College, the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, the Institute for Advanced Study, Leadership Enterprise for a Diverse America, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and is the director of Google Inc. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Shirley Tillman.
Nice introduction. Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. It is wonderful to be here. It is wonderful to see so many students here. Not that I don't like to see my faculty colleagues, but this, I think, event was really intended for graduate students, so it's delightful to see so many of you here. Let me see if I can get this underway. There we go. So the title of this talk really came from the fact that I spent the year after I stepped down from president in London, where for those of you who have traveled the London Underground, which is what that map is, you are constantly being reminded to mind the gap so that you don't fall onto the tracks. And so it's a phrase that has sort of stayed with me, and it seemed entirely appropriate to think about mind the gap when we're thinking about the challenges that still persist even today for increasing the participation of women in science and engineering and mathematics. And but I want to frame our discussion today, which will, for a large part, be fairly upbeat. I'm going to tell you in advance. By trying to frame it within two things that I think are broadly relevant to our discussion. And the first is the issues that we are thinking about in looking at the underrepresentation of women in science and engineering and mathematics are not unique to our fields. In fact, there is probably no more incendiary issue that a writer could write about today than the underrepresentation of women across all employment sectors. And I can defend that statement by the remarkable impact that Sheryl Sandberg's book about these issues had. This is a book that probably received less attention, although a very interesting book, by Deborah Spar, the president of Barnard. And what's amazing, many of us who know Anne-Marie Slaughter from here at Princeton know that her article in The Atlantic, Why Women Still Can't Have It All, was the single most downloaded article in the history of The Atlantic magazine. So this is an issue that is of intense interest, not just in our field, but across all employment sectors. That's the first framing that I want to do. The second framing I want to do is to point out that maybe every scientist at every period in history has said the following, but I'm going to say it for our period. The issues to be addressed by scientists and engineers right now are as exciting as they have ever been. And they are deep, and they are profound, and they are important to the future well-being of the planet. So if ever there was a time when we wanted to exploit the full gene pool, speaking as a geneticist, the full capacity of the human race to begin to address some of these questions, this is the moment. And that is true whether it is understanding the brain, which is, I think going to be one of the great challenges of the 21st century, climate change, agriculture for a growing global population, the impact that computer science is having on our lives. Where is that going? The genomics revolution, understanding what is the nature of matter, the fact that we do not yet understand 95% of what constitutes the universe is a startling thing. And so all of this is by way of saying that this is an extraordinarily exciting time to be a scientist or an engineer. And we have to keep remembering that as we continue to argue for more inclusiveness in the professions. So where have we come from? And I'm going to tell some upbeat numbers because I think it's important as we look at the continuing challenges to remember how far we have come. So this is the production of women PhDs in STEM fields in 30 years between 1983 and 2013. And the bottom line of this slide is numbers matter. It makes a difference. So these increases in life sciences, in the physical sciences, in engineering, are extremely important. And as important that they happened as it's important that this is the foundation on which we're going to build toward the future. In every case, we've seen really substantial increases in the number of women PhDs across the sciences. Now, what's happened at Princeton? I don't have the data going back 30 years, but you can see that over the last basically 10 years, there has been what I would call a very slow, the slope is positive, but not by much, slow increase in the number of PhDs that are being awarded to women. This looks a little better in the natural sciences than it does in engineering. If you sum across all of them, there was a 23% increase from the 04-05 academic year to the 13-14 academic year. We should celebrate the fact that the slope is positive. We should be critical of the fact that it's not positive enough. So what happens to those women PhDs as they gain their PhDs? And this is looking at the employment of STEM PhDs in tenure track positions. And again, looking at a slightly different time frame because I couldn't find the most recent data when I went to look for it. But this is looking essentially over a 20-year period from 1985 to 2006. And again, it's not surprising given what I showed you about PhD production is that the numbers have almost doubled in computer science, have doubled in the life sciences, have tripled in the physical sciences, and a five-fold increase in engineering. And that's what you would expect to see. That's what you would want to see as the number of women receiving PhDs. They are, in fact, joining the faculty. And that's good news, but it's what you would expect. There are some aspects of this, though, that I think merit attention and are a little less positive. And this is a slide that looks at the percentage of full professors that are women, and the year that was chosen in this particular example was 2006. And you can see, so the number of full professors was in roughly 20%. But here's what I think we need to keep a watch on. This is the percentage of full-time professors at research institutions. So obviously in this category includes small liberal arts colleges, potentially even community colleges, where the faculty are going to be less likely to be engaged in significant research. And you can see that as you go from the total of academic positions down to the research institutes, the percentage of women fall. And here's what I think is also worrisome. This is the number of full-time professors with children. And you can see the number falls again. Here's the number of full-time professors who are even married, and the number falls again. So women, in other words, are being asked or making, they're not being asked, but they are making life decisions that are different from their male colleagues as they join the faculty. And that's something I think that we need to be thinking about very, very hard. So what does it look like at Princeton? So here are Princeton numbers. This is 1975, 1976, and this is the growth in the number of women in tenured and assistant professor positions in the natural sciences. And the turquoise line here is the total. And so again, the news is positive, right? The slope is positive. Beginning, really in about the mid-1980s, there has been a steady increase in the total number of women in the faculty in the natural sciences. The reason the green line, which are assistant professors, is so lumpy is because the numbers are so small. And so 1 or 2 differences in a year will cause the percentage to jump around very significantly. So I don't think that's the particularly important number to look at. I think it's really the total, and then the blue line shows you what is happening with the number of tenured women in the natural sciences. So if you look at this graph, you can see that although the slope is positive, there are periods where we appear to be making relatively little progress, which unfortunately is the time I was president. So honesty in advertising here, folks. Although clearly doing much better at identifying assistant professors. So this is good news, but again, I would say news that could be very significantly improved upon. And that certainly characterizes what we see in engineering. So this is the same graph, but now what we're looking at is our women faculty in engineering. And you can see that it bumped around at very, very few until the 1990s, and then the slope started to go up. Again, I don't think you should take any 1 year's data as dispositive because, again, unfortunately, the numbers are small. But the number of tenured women is continuing to rise in engineering. So, good news, slope is positive, but we're a long way at 15% of the tenured faculty being women from being where we think we should really be if we're going to be a robust institution representing the gene pool. So if you look at non-academic fields, you see that women and men, are distributed in a lot of categories. And I'm not going to go through these in any great detail. It's simply to make 2 observations about how they distribute differently. And what you find is that if you add up sort of all of the individuals who are in industry, either in basic, applied, or development, men are overrepresented in industry relative to women. So it's these 3 on the right-hand side add up to what is happening in industry. Where women are overrepresented is in the government and in what this study called professional and other services, which include things like having gone to medical school, having gone to law school after a PhD, so have gone into the professions. And women tend to be overrepresented in those fields. So industry is a place that has traditionally absorbed a very significant number of science and engineering PhDs, but they're certainly absorbing them at a higher rate for men than they are for women. Okay, so I've painted a very broad stroke picture that largely says that progress is being made, that progress is slow. We're not seeing revolutionary effects of the attention that has been paid to this issue over the years. So what are the continuing obstacles that stand in the way of making more significant progress in the future? And I'm going to focus today on largely research that comes out of social science, because I think we are learning a tremendous amount from social science studies of what is going on, not just in this profession, in science and engineering, but across the board. And I want to talk about some that may be very familiar to those of you who are in psychology. So I think one of the most important things that we have to begin to take into account is something that Claude Steele, a psychologist who's now the provost at Berkeley, first really coined as stereotype threat, or what I call the self-confidence deficit. And I think this became clearer and clearer to us, and certainly to me, I should say, when I asked Nan Cohen a few years ago to do a study of the nature of undergraduate women leadership here at Princeton. And we embarked upon this study because we had noticed that undergraduate women were making different choices about how they wanted to spend their time at Princeton outside the classroom. And probably the most important thing that came out of that study was that these young women were coming into Princeton less self-confident than their male classmates. And what was even more disturbing is they were leaving Princeton less self-confident than their male colleagues. So for example, one of the observations that I can tell you about in my own field, and I think this is true in chemistry as well, is that although we are basically at parity, with 50% of the PhDs going to women today. So, you know, the pipeline is full, basically. When our department sends out a request for assistant professor positions, when we ask people to apply, 25% of the applicants are women. What is going on? Now, there are multiple things going on. It is, and we'll come to one of the other reasons why I think that is the case. But some fraction, I think, is the self-confidence deficit. The measurement that women make that say, I'm looking at that career path at a very high-powered place like Princeton, that's not for me. I don't think I can compete in that arena. I'm much better off going to a place that is going to put less competitive pressure on me. And I would say that a significant fraction of the time that is not a correct analysis, but that is the analysis that women are making more than men are making. So I think it's a self-confidence deficit. What Claude Steele brilliantly showed is that there is a true phenomenon called stereotype threat, which when someone is afraid of confirming a negative stereotype, their performance and their behavior changes. And so I think that is also very much a part of this story. And you know, defining it and getting it out is the beginning to think about how we can manage it going forward. The other one, and this is one that I think everybody is now laser focused on, which is the phenomenon of unconscious bias. And I found this quote on the web, which from arguably one of the most accomplished women in the world, Christine Lagarde, who runs the IMF. And here's what she said about unconscious bias. Unconsciously, we tend to like people who look like us, think like us, and come from backgrounds similar to us. Everyone likes to think he or she is open-minded and objective. But research has shown that the beliefs and values gained from family, culture, and a lifetime of experiences heavily influences how we view and evaluate both others and ourselves. And there are now literally hundreds of studies that confirm this view that we are all victims of unconscious bias. And I just want to show you two that were published in the PNAS last year. So this was a study, the senior author was Joe Handelsman from Yale. And it's a classic study where you take a single CV, you attach to half of them a male name, half of them a female name, you send them out anonymously and say, would you be interested in interviewing this individual for a position in your laboratory? And this was across the sciences. And you know, the shocking thing that came out of this is that despite the fact these were identical CVs with identical accomplishments, the applicants with male names were viewed more as having greater competence, greater hireability, would be more interested in mentoring this individual, and what's even more just galling, be willing to pay more. Be willing to pay more. This is unconscious bias at work and in our own profession. Here's another one that was really galling to me, done by two individuals, one at MIT and one at Twitter, which is kind of interesting. So here's what they did. They went to male PIs who were in the white bars, were highly accomplished. This is in the life sciences. HHMI investigators, National Academy members, award winners, Nobel Prize winners, Lasker Award winners. They're all these, awards that we all know. And they looked at the composition of their laboratories. And what they discovered for male faculty, for postdocs, is that these highly accomplished investigators had significantly, that's what obviously the stars mean, the asterisk, more male graduate student postdocs in this case, and graduate students over here. You don't see the effect with female faculty who have those same degrees of accomplishment. They are not, and in fact, in one case, it worked in the opposite direction. Award winners, actually, female award winners had more females in their laboratories. Now, why does this matter? This matters because these are pipeline labs. These are the labs that are sending people on to successful academic careers. And these highly accomplished investigators are clearly exhibiting unconscious bias. The last one I want to tell you about is a fascinating study done by Sarah Jane Leslie, who's sitting right here, for those of you who do not know her, where she looked at the question of cultural norms. Cultural norms within scientific disciplines, actually all academic disciplines, and she tried to tease out why women are succeeding more often in some fields than others. And I hope you invite her to give this lecture next year, because she has a lot of interesting things to tell you about this. But basically what she discovered is that there are cultural norms in fields that then are either attracting or repelling the inclusion of women. And the one that is indicated here in this slide is that fields where there is the cultural perception that in order to succeed, you must be brilliant. Or as Sarah said, she always said, like you have a beam coming out of your forehead. You're just brilliant. Are male-dominated fields. And fields where there is the perception that if you're a good worker, a hard worker, really willing to put in the time, those are fields where women succeed very well and are attracted into. So here's a cultural norm that is affecting the inclusion of women. So I think we're learning a tremendous amount from social science. Let me add one last barrier that I think is increasingly problematic for women in particular, and that is what is happening to the length of PhDs and the increasing practice of doing not just one postdoctoral fellowship, but multiple postdoctoral fellowships, which is delaying the age at which an individual leaves training positions, graduate students and postdocs, and becomes an independent employee, whether it's in academia, whether it's industry, it really doesn't matter because this affects both. These are data from my own field, which is where the problem is most dire. But it just gives you a sense of how dramatic the demographic change in the field has been over time. This is 1980, this is 2010. And what we're looking at here is the number of NIH grantees who are under the age of 36. So when I was starting out in 1980, it was roughly 16%. It was pretty usual to be, I was 30, to be under the age of 36. Look where it is today. It's someplace around 3%. So this is meaning that it is longer and longer and longer before you are actually an independent investigator. And of course, this is what, it will not surprise you that the number of investigators over the age of 66 in 1980 was de minimis, and today it is now about 7%. So there's been this demographic switch in the field that I think is really working against women who, after all, have a ticking biological clock that we are all aware of that is happening at this time when they do not have independence and where their earning capacity is very much diminished. So those are some of the, I think, the trends and the obstacles that are continuing to bedevil our ability to expand the number of opportunities for women in science engineering. And so I wanted to just go through in the last couple of minutes just some of the things that I think we should all be doing. Some of them are motherhood and apple pie. There is no silver bullet. If there were a silver bullet, you know, Sarah, if there were a silver bullet, I would, whoops, I would run for it. But here's some that I think we, certainly as a university community, should be focused in on. The first thing is, I think that women are well served by thinking hard as early as they possibly can about where they want their career to go. And then to receive effective mentoring to get there. And the poster child for this is a graduate student of mine, a former graduate student, Amy Hark, and this is Amy on the right with her orange Princeton gown. And she is now a tenured associate professor at Muhlenberg College. So how'd she get there? She came into my lab first day and came into my office and said, my goal is to teach in a small liberal arts college. I said, great, let's take that and let's run with it. So she planned her entire graduate and postgraduate career around that goal. So what did she do? She taught more than the average graduate student in molecular biology at the time. So she volunteered, she taught, you know, she TA'd with me in every course I taught, and I gave her lots of opportunity to practice teaching. She, by the way, had a spectacular research graduate career. When she graduated, instead of going directly onto a research postdoc, which is what the vast majority of mobile students do, she went and taught as a substitute at Kalamazoo College for a year so that she could get on her resume the fact that this dedication to teaching and the fact that she had a year's experience as a professor. She then went and did a postdoc where she changed organisms. So in biology, the organism is God. I work on mice. It's very expensive. You can't do it in a liberal arts college. So she switched to plants, which you can do really easily, did a postdoc. And by the time she went on the job market, she had, you know, half a dozen job offers because she had really figured out how to design her training to coincide with what her career goal was. And obviously, here she is, very successful. So plan and get good mentoring. Here's another that I think comes right out of some of the social science research that I talked about, which is we need training in both recognizing and combating unconscious bias and changing cultural norms. So one of the things Sarah Jane is talking about is how to stop people talking about brilliant mathematicians, brilliant philosophers, you know, genius, right? Using words that send messages that often say to women, that's not a field where I'm going to excel. So changing cultural norms. I think this training and recognizing unconscious bias is tremendously difficult. I don't want to underestimate how challenging that is going to be, because this is deep inside who we are. And getting it out on the table and recognizing it is the first step, but this is, I think, where a lot of the work needs to be done. It needs to be done when we're reviewing applicants for graduate school. It needs to be done when we're reviewing postdoctoral fellowship applications. It's got to be done when we're hiring, and certainly even when we're promoting. So we have all of us this in us, and we've got to figure out how we're going to counter it. You know, here's a real motherhood and apple pie, which is, I think, the other reason why we go from 50% of PhDs to 25% of PhDs is because the challenge of balancing family and work begins to rear its ugly head at about the time when people are thinking about how they're going to transition out of training into permanent positions. And if they see career paths that look completely hostile to the idea of being a parent, it's going to be really discouraging and problematic. And this phrase it's actually a quote from me, where I was giving a talk on this issue about 10 years ago at Columbia. And a lot of you in the room will not remember James Carville, but he was one of the individuals who ran Clinton's, I think, his first run at the presidency. And his phrase for the whole campaign was, "It's the economy, stupid," meaning that's what you should focus on. That's the only thing that matters. You know, keep your eye on the prize. And I feel the same way about daycare. I think if you are not sending signals that say that we understand that peace of mind in having a child, particularly in those early years, is not important to the institution, it will be much harder to really, I think, promote the careers of women. I also think that Princeton has come a long way in recent years in creating family-friendly policies around tenure, friendly policies around elder care as well as child care, because those kinds of emergencies happen at all stages. Creating opportunities for individuals to take children to scientific meetings so that you're not having to forego the opportunity of participating in a meeting simply because you have a child at home. So I think there are lots that we can do, including not scheduling seminars at 5 o'clock, for example, that signal that we're conscious that this is a major issue. This is obviously not a women's issue. This is a parent issue. But let's all be honest with one another. These tend to fall more often on the shoulders of women than men, despite all the progress that we have made in recent years in promoting a parent-centric view of child rearing rather than a maternal one. And here's the last thing that I think we need to do, and that is, if I have a criticism of my generation, and I have many criticisms of my generation, but the one criticism is that I think we did not spend enough time telling the success stories. And there are so many success stories there. And we spent way too much time kind of focused on all the obstacles. So I have been trying, whenever I'm asked to do one of these, is to celebrate the many women who have succeeded in having extraordinary careers and even average careers in science and engineering and mathematics. And so I always like to end. Here we have 3 Nobel laureates, Linda Buck, Christian Nusslein-Volhard, and Liz Blackburn, 3 extraordinary scientists. We have a field medal winner, Miriam Mirzakhani, who was actually an assistant professor here, and we lost her, tragically, to Stanford. Really tragically, really tragically. Here's a Princeton former graduate student, Sue Biggins, who was just elected to the National Academy this week, a wonderful cell biologist. Barbara Gross, a computer scientist, ran the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard. Jackie Barton, a chemist at Caltech. Here's another Princeton graduate student, Frances Arnold at Caltech, an engineer. Vera Rubin, an astrophysicist. Debbie Jin, another Princeton, actually a Princeton undergraduate, Debbie Jin, who's a physicist in Colorado. I picked these because I know them, but I could have replicated this slide over and over and over and over and over again. There are extraordinary women out there who have figured out how to navigate this career path, and they've all done it differently. There is not, there's not a recipe here, folks. Each one of them has navigated it in a different way with a different set of life circumstances. But they're there, and we should celebrate them. And the reason we should celebrate them is because these are the future women in science. And this is what we should care about, right? These are the girls who right now are thinking that science is totally cool. And we want to make sure that the path that gets them into science is a path that looks well greased by those of us who are in it right now. So I'm going to end there, and I'd be happy to engage in any conversation that any of you would like to have. Thank you for being here and for listening. Dead silence. Yes. Emily. Yes.
Shirley, of course, that was wonderful. There was a New York Times editorial recently that actually Jeremy Kasdan, who's sitting over here, forwarded to me before I had had a chance to find it myself. And it was talking about how to get more women into engineering. And I actually think it made a really interesting point, which is a little different than what you had brought up. And I think it's worth pointing out that one way in which we may be able to get more women into engineering and science is to focus on the fact that it could lead to meaningful impact. You mentioned it, right? Yeah. Meaningful impact on the world. But the fact that once there was, that article talked about, if you can talk about the way in which, in this case, engineering contributes to society, and talk about that, and not about the fact that you need to be brilliant to do it, could very well bring more women into the field. Yeah,
I read that as well, and I was, it rang very true to me. Yeah,
so we need better marketing.
Yeah, we need better marketing, and all of those, those scientific questions that were on that slide, to one degree or another, are potentially enormously impactful. Yeah.
My understanding of unconscious bias is that we women are just as bad as the men. And you showed that slide with the senior men who were women in their labs.
Yeah.
So I'm curious whether the research really suggests which direction the causal arrows go there. Is it the choice of the senior men really, or is it potentially also?
Yeah, and of course that study could not distinguish between the push and the pull, right? Which is a very important point, and again, that would then come back to the confidence, the self-confidence issue, right? So those two things are not unrelated to one another, and the way in which they then funnel into the kinds of decisions that you saw on that slide. That study could not make the distinction between this was whether women were simply not applying to those labs, or whether men were selecting men. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for that great talk. So you showed the difference in numbers from PhDs, or 50-50 in many of the sciences, to tenure track positions. and also the rising age of independence. And I think one of the stages that is responsible for that is the postdoc stage, that sits in between, where we lose a lot of women. And I was recently at a conference where we sat at the dinner of all the invited speakers, and we noticed that there were several women there, and we all had 2 children and tenure track. And I said, wow, this is so amazing that now this has been this is commonplace. And someone pointed out that the problem is that if you have children as a postdoc, you're much more likely to just leave for many reasons. So Sheryl Sandberg talks about this in Lean, and you're getting a very low salary. Right. You're not, in many cases, not supported by the university. You don't get precedence in you don't get preference for child care. You don't get a long maternity leave. You don't get a semester off teaching or your research. Right. Your PI doesn't get money to pay you a salary to sit at home. Right. And so you just leave, whereas when you're already a professor, well, you can't just leave your lab and never show up again. Right. So the question is, how can we put more emphasis on not losing the postdocs at that stage, so that we get more assistant professors?
Yeah, we were just talking about this at the table ahead of time, which is that although my own field is probably the worst offender, and I'm embarrassed to have to say that, but it is absolutely true, that the mean age at which someone in molecular biology gets a tenure track position is 37 and a half. 37 and a half. And that's because the length of the PhD has increased. And what is even worse, and a bigger factor, is the length of the postdoc has increased, and often requiring not one but multiple postdocs. It is a system, and I tried to imply that in the slide, that is really harming women disproportionately. There's no question about it. I've been actually working with 3 co-authors on trying to bring this issue to the attention of the community and begin to propose things that we could do to reverse the trend, which is all going in the wrong direction. I mean, absolutely going in the wrong direction. And I think you've put your finger on why this is so detrimental for women. It's disproportionately detrimental. I think a man getting his first job at 37 is bad too, but it is unlikely to have the same consequence. So I think I agree with you completely. Jeremy?
Yeah, is that due something endemic to changes in the field, or is it due to just oversupply?
Oversupply, pure and simple. The bitterest of bitter pills for my colleagues to swallow, but the data are irrefutable that we've been overproducing biomedical PhDs probably for 20 years.
So you talked about, inequities in hiring or in the rate of tenured faculty. How some studies recently also have looked at even just the language that's present in recommendation letters is often very different for female and male trainees. So, how do we combat that? And is there really any sort of look to mindfulness for people who are writing these letters, how to write their letters to be more equal?
I mean, there's no question. It's a part of the unconscious bias, right? Having sat on the appointment and promotion committee at the university for 12 years, having chaired it, and having read thousands of letters of recommendation, I completely agree with you that although it is not true in every case, you see these trends where people feel perfectly comfortable commenting on personality with women, and much less often will have a comment about personality about a man. So I think it's all got to be folded into the training that we need to do to uncover these kinds of biases and help people recognize, and no one's a bad guy here. This is really, as I said, this is deep in our psychology, that you've got to proactively be aware of it. And it's the only solution. I don't know, Joan, if you have other solutions from psychology, but...
I mean, people have to be able to read a letter and say, oh, look at that.
She's pleasant and hardworking, and he's brilliant.
Yeah. 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 Oh.
You showed this slide with all the successful women. You said a lot of them took different paths. So what advice do you have for women who don't have really any examples to follow? So they're truly following kind of uncharted territory. So it's kind of hard to do something no one else they haven't seen done before. So do you have any advice for people in that situation?
You know, in many ways, I was in that position when I was a student and a fellow, and I'm going to say something that seems trivial, but I think it's really important. Choose your mentors well. You know, there were no women around for me to consult about how to proceed, but I had two male mentors, one as a graduate student, one as a postdoc, who were just extraordinary. I'm not sure I knew that when I chose them, but my advice now is really pay attention, because if there aren't women out there to model your career over, find a really great guy who is sensitive to these issues, and happily, increasingly, there are more and more of them out there. The other is, I think there's more similarities among disciplines than you think there is. And so if you're in a discipline where there are very, very few women, I would look to the side. Because I don't think I think some things are very discipline specific, but a lot of this isn't. Yeah. Yeah. We have a question here.
Hi. So recently in PNAS there was an article published about a national hiring experiment revealing a 2-to-1 faculty preference for women on STEM tenure track careers. And so one of my male colleagues sent this to me, and my immediate reaction was one of embarrassment. Because if I'm ever to pursue a tenure track career, I would never want for my male colleagues to think like, oh, she got there because she's a woman and there is this unconscious gender bias for women in faculty positions. So I don't know whether to really believe the results of this article, but I was just wondering if you had thoughts about that and what women can do to sort of feel, I guess it's to do with the imposter syndrome in every level of career path.
You know, my first, I haven't read the paper. I really should take the time and go and read the paper carefully. My first reaction was, who are you kidding? Yeah, and what alternate universe are you in? You know, that may be deeply unfair, I have to say, but it certainly does not comport with my experience. And this may be one of those classic examples where people tell surveyors what they think the surveyor wants to hear, or what makes them feel, you know, honorable. And, you know, my answer to that paper is seeing is believing. And I mean, who do they actually hire? Right? As opposed to who do they think they prefer to hire? Yeah. Emily.
Well, just a quick follow-up on that. I'm not 100% sure which article you're talking about, but I remember reading after that article came out that there were a number of people who said that, I thought that article was debunked, basically, that there were studies, you know, that the authors of that study were known to have also completed questionable work in the past, if I remember correctly, and also that there were other studies which completely came to the opposite conclusions. So I guess it would be good for one to find those and shoot them back to whoever sent you the article.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's not right.
Yeah.
I guess just going back to the comment or the topic of making women feel like they don't have to choose between family and career. One thing that I wanted to point out, so I'm a synthetic chemist, and along the lines we were talking about long postdocs, and if you have a kid while you're a postdoc, then it's difficult. But one of the things that comes up is if I wanted to have a kid, I would have to stop everything because I don't want to do research, synthetic chemistry research while pregnant or with a young child. And I think one of the things that I don't ever hear is, I think there's the perception that there's a bias if you took a year or two off completely and then went back into the sciences. I think that looks bad on your resume, and or at least I think a lot of people question, like, why did you stop and then come back in? And I think it should be much more acceptable for men and women to do that. And that maybe that would help, so that you could decide to start your family, you know, right before a postdoc or right after a postdoc, and then go back into the sciences.
Yeah, and of course there is this, you know, this catch-22, which is you know, in my generation, it was common to wait until you had a position before beginning a family, because you were beginning your position when you were 30. You know, today when it's 37 and a half, you know, that's not an option anymore. So it is this lengthening of the training is a deeply problematic problem. Yeah, you know, I don't know your field, and I don't know the nature of the chemicals that you are working with, but I had several women have children as postdoctoral fellows in my lab, and we arranged things so that they were basically not exposed to, in our case, the big problem was radioactivity.
Yeah, but there's a lot of women that wouldn't even feel comfortable with that arrangement, even if you tried to keep it
Yeah,
good.
yeah, and it's personal. I understand it's personal, but before giving up, I would explore that just a little bit further. To, yeah, okay. Okay. All right, I realize, okay. Yeah, Pablo.
Any interesting regional differences, say, between the academy in Europe and here, or in parts of Europe, or good lessons?
Yeah, I think the last time I looked carefully at the European data, they are either where we are or significantly behind. There are European countries where it is really challenging to be a woman scientist, and some of it actually does relate to cultural norms around childcare. The cultural norm is that women stay home and take care of children. And those countries, it's much harder for a woman to, you know, to make progress. Yeah. Yeah.
Going back to your comment about how you sat on the promotions committee and you read all these letters, do you have a feeling for what the percentages are of, like, when a man goes up for these promotions and a woman, is there bias that the man will get it more preferentially over a woman, or?
The great thing that I can say that about Princeton is we looked at this several times over the course of the time I was chairing the committee, and the promotion rate of women and men were virtually identical. So there is no bias. And it really is that once you're on that track, your likelihood of succeeding on that track is no different between men and women. I will say that a very important study that was conducted first at MIT back in 1999-2000, and that was then replicated at a number of universities, including Princeton, in the early 2000s, chaired by Ginger Zakian, professor of molecular biology, looked pretty carefully at other metrics other than just promotion, looked at things like space, looked at things like startup funds, looked at things like salary, looked at, you know, all of the other things that go into setting you up for success as a scientist. And we found some disparities that we then went in and tried to correct over time. So you know, this is an issue where a professor of astrophysics who is now emeritus, Jill Knapp, used to say, you know, eternal vigilance is the order of the day, that we're not at a time yet where we can stop paying attention to those kinds of issues. Yeah.
So related to that, Nancy Hopkins gave a talk here several years ago, and she exactly talked about that, about employing the field every few years because the bias is creeping in.
Right.
Is that done at Princeton to kind of look around and say, okay, we need to give
So we have an infamous summer meeting every year, and I'm presuming, Pablo, that this meeting still happens, where the president, the provost, the dean of the faculty, the dean of the graduate school, the dean of engineering, the vice president for research, the dean of the college, sit in a very small room for 3 solid days and pore over every piece of data about every single department, and we look for disparities. We look for things that look out of kilter on lots of fronts, not just gender, but we're looking for one of the metrics that we pay the most attention to is placement of graduate students. If we see a department that is not placing its graduate students in reasonable jobs after graduation, we start to worry about whether that is a department that is overtraining. So we actually do it on an annual basis. Yeah. And Pablo's nodding. It's a marathon for those of us who've gone through it. Yeah.
On the subject of helping postdocs or graduate students that want to take time off for maternity, a very little known fact about most NIH institutes and some places at NSF is that funds are often available for grant supplements that allow you to hire a research technician or an assistant for a period of a year to do a lot of work usually while one lab member is on leave, but I assume it could also be tweaked even in certain stages of pregnancy. But that's something that very few PIs are actually aware of, and very few directors of NIH institutes publicize. But it's something that you can have your PI ask their program officer about.
Yeah, that's something that is probably worth reminding people of, along with the fact that we have a fund in the Dean of the Faculty's office that you can apply to take your child to scientific meetings, which is, I think, a very important thing when you are young and have very small children that you don't want to leave at home. But going to a meeting is really an important part of your career.
I just want to add that the graduate students should look at the Family Friendly Initiative page under Student Life in the graduate school web page, because there are a number of programs for graduate students here, including extra time if you have a child as a graduate student, and support for that time. We have not been able to do that for postdocs because that gets you into the grant PI situation where we're not using Princeton money, it's government money or other people's money. And there you have to follow the granting agency's rules, whatever they are. But we have very strong set of programs for graduate students as well as for faculty, so I urge the graduate students to go look at that.
Yes, Sarah Jane.
Just starting with a quick comment, a question about the PNAS article. The question about the PNAS article that purported to show that women have an advantage. There are just many, many things that are scientifically wrong with that article. It was not well conducted, and many of us in the field were very surprised to see it published in an outlet like PNAS. That said, what I was curious to hear your thoughts on, Shirley, was what sort of structuring for mentoring do you think is most effective? Because there's one model, right, where it's more informal, people seeking out their own mentors, and this is particularly amongst faculty where there's not an advisor sort of structure. Right. But you might also have a more formalized program.
Yeah. So at the level of graduate students, I think the National Institutes of Health has begun to really promote the idea of very formal annual reviews that involve a conversation not just with your advisor, but actually with your graduate committee, where you talk about not just how the science is going, because that's what you always talk about, but what are your plans? What are you thinking about? How can we help you think about moving in that direction? Do I think it's being done equally well in all places and in all examples? Absolutely not. But it's at least alerting people to the importance of thinking about your trainees as individuals who are on the path to someplace else, and not simply worker bees in your lab, which is how they are often thought about in the past. You know, I've seen formal mentoring programs that work really well. When that happens, there's some flexibility about who mentors who and some rejiggering because as you know, not all chemistry is going to work. And if the chemistry isn't ideal, people are going to avoid having those conversations with one another. So I think formal ones with the proper flexibility can really work well. The best that I've ever seen are always the informal ones. The ones where someone really wants to be a mentor and the other individual really values the mentoring tremendously. But that often doesn't happen by chance. So I think mentoring is tough, really tough, to get it right. We all, say it's important and then we have a hard time figuring out how to put it in place. I agree with that.
Well, I think we're running out of time, but if everyone will help me thank Shirley Tillman one more time for this great talk.
Thank you. Oh my goodness. Thank you. Those are beautiful.